Hi, and welcome. I'm Simi, and this is the Judaism from Within podcast. What we're going to do over the next 2 weeks before Pesach is go through the 6 essays that Rav Hirsch has on Nisan in his collective writings. My goal is to structure it, frame it, and articulate it to you in a way that you can repeat it, show the relevance, show the modern parallels to these ideas. We're going to start from number 6. Now, this, for Rav Hirsch, is the Magna Carta of the Jewish people. Now, this is an important idea to focus on. Rav Hirsch looks at the Jewish people as being slaves. Well, obviously we were slaves, but he tries to focus in on the psychological trauma or the embedded generational trauma that takes place through being a slave. Let's break this down. They weren't just slaves. Everyone, to a certain extent, was a slave because everybody was under the king. The king was a god. This was a world where power dominated. The king was the most powerful, thereby the king was a god. This is what the sociologists call pre-Axel age thinking, where everything was associated with power rather than with a sort of a higher moral, ethical ideal. That was the ancient world in Egypt. The king was a god. Pharaoh was a god. But Rav Hirsch develops this on a deeper level, that the average citizen was subservient to the state. The average citizen, with property even if they were part of the temple, they were still a cog in the machine of the state. A slave, on the other hand, had no individuality, had no home. They were raw material in the hands of the state. That was the world of the Jew in ancient Egypt. Now, this is key from a developmental standpoint, because we have to have a sort of tabula rasa, a clean slate in which the nobility of Judaism is built upon. But let's break it down on a more symbolic level. Rav Hirsch uses the Bris Bein Abbasarim as a stepping stone to this idea. What was the Bris Bein Abbasarim? It was the promise that the Jewish people would suffer. They would go down to Egypt. But it wasn't just told to us. It was demonstrated to us. There was an ox, there was a ram, and there was a goat. The ox, the economy, the driving force of a economic system. The ram, that sort of the leadership, and the goat, that stubbornness. Rav Hirsch sees as being the building blocks of a society. But what happened to them in the Bris Bein Abbasarim with Avram? They were massacred. They were split open. Rav Hirsch sees that as being these 3 aspects of what makes a person or makes a society, as being ruptured, taken apart. But that wasn't it. Now, this is the first sort of sign of hope we have. So we have the symbolism of the oppression, but there were birds. Avram had to have birds as well. Rav Hirsch looks at the birds as being the symbol of the free spirit, of the neshama, of that creative will that wasn't broken. They weren't ripped apart. They weren't taken apart by the vultures later, by the oppressor. They stayed whole. So we have the problem, meaning if we're going to discuss what the Korban Pesach does as a Magna Carta of the Jewish people, we have to fully analyze and appreciate the problem. What was the framework the Jewish people were in that you had to build off? That, for Rav Hirsch, is the oppression, the internalized generational trauma symbolized by the Bris Bein Abbasarim, and then lived out in Egypt over generations. Now we have the problem. It's interesting. You can see this from a parallel in our modern experience. What aspects of these 3 areas of our experience do we see degraded in the modern world? That of our input as a cog in a machine, a KPI, or a data that's being farmed, or our ability to have a leadership role, or our individuality, or that stubbornness that allows a person to have the confidence to move through life, how these are degraded in the modern world. But now let's move on to the solution. The solution for Rav Hirsch is what he calls the Magna Carta. And not to quibble over the metaphor, the Magna Carta was put together in 1215 by King John, in Runnymede, I believe, where the barons forced the king to sort of agree to certain basic frameworks of law and accountability. Now, this wasn't an ideal. This wasn't a individual renaissance for the average serf. But it was symbolically, or from a mythic standpoint, the first stage where the powerful had to recognize the dignity of the individual. It's used as a platform that we always go back to as being that first articulation of human dignity by a state. That's what Rav Hirsch is playing on. So what does he do? He says if we go through the process of the Korban Pesach, we can see each stage representing a key move in the Jewish people's growth as a nation. The first stage, each individual had to take. Individuals, an ish, each one as a self-aware individual, had to be in a situation where they weren't part of a bureaucratic system. It wasn't opening with the council, say, the elders begin. No, you as an individual, radical individualism, that you as an individual have a responsibility, have a role, have a duty in relationship to God. You can make a shliach. There's responsibility you can live out for someone else. For Rav Hirsch, we will call this the covenant of the individual as that first stage of the building block of the Jewish people. The second stage, what do you take? Well, this is slightly counterintuitive. You take a lamb. A lamb isn't a lamb the biggest follower. Well, no, we're going to call this the covenant of equality. If everyone is a lamb in the service of God, well, then that makes the vertical relationship constant. Everyone is under the same vertical relationship with the Almighty, which means there's no horizontal hierarchies anymore. That is the key point about God being the shepherd. Because if God is the shepherd and we are the lamb, thereby we are under God. We're under the highest ideal, but that vertical relationship equalizes all other horizontal relationships. So you have the covenant of the individual, the covenant of equality. And then lastly, the covenant of the home. What holds this together? Not once again the state, not once again the bureaucratic machine. No, it's the home. The home built by individuals. That is a free statement. You choose the home you are in. That is the building blocks of the Jewish people. And Rav Hirsch looks at this as a building block of society. If a society doesn't have homes where the moral worth emerges from, a society is doomed to rot. You can't have it top down. It must be bottom up. Now, we have that tripartite structure of what it means to be an individual with equality, responsibility, but housed in the home as being the focal point of a Jewish person's life and a Jewish person's mission. Rav Hirsch always points out that the idea of a shul is not the focal point of a Jewish person's home, a Jewish person's spiritual life. The shul, from a school, is where you learn how to live your life out. The focal point for a Jewish person's spiritual growth is their home. It is what houses the individual under God. So, what's the next stage? But then what joins these homes? What joins these homes with other homes? Why isn't this tribalism? Why isn't this just a call for you, me and my brother against my neighbor against the tribe, and the tribe against the world? No. Rav Hirsch points out that what joins these together is chesed, is loving kindness, but not just classic loving kindness of, oh, I have sympathy for you, I care for you. But once again, sympathy as a joining glue of a society is lovely on some level, but is also potentially toxic because you have power imbalances. When I feel sorry for you, when I have empathy for you, you are beneath me. That is not the way of the Jewish people. The way of the Jewish people is that when your home is too big, if your home is too big for the Carta Pesach that you have to seek out another home. You have to seek out another home and ask for them to join. You ask for them to join in your home and to partake in your meal. It turns empathy into duty. It raises the dignity of the one receiving rather than based off need and dependence. So we have the covenant of the individual. We have the covenant of equality. We have the covenant of the home. And lastly, the covenant of dignity. But there's one last. What is the makeup? What is the metaphysical structure of this identity? What is the covenant of identity? What type of lamb are we to be? That is the final question. You've described to me the individuality. You've described to me the equality. You've described to me the home. But lastly, who am I as an individual? What is my relationship to God? What is my relationship to the divine? Rav Hirsch says this is key. It is tomim. It is supposed to be complete. It is supposed to be male, and it is supposed to be in its first year. And each one of these should paint our approach to Yiddishkeit today, should paint our approach to Judaism today. It should be tomim. It should be complete. That means there's no compartmentalizing. There's not your secular life and your Jewish life. There's not the time you were in the temple and the time that you were no. You are in one unified, integrated individual. This doesn't mean that you're perfect. This doesn't mean that you don't fail. This doesn't mean that we can't grow. But it means the approach is I'm looking to be integrated. I'm not looking to compartmentalize my life. That is tomim. Zochar, a male, putting gendered politics to one side for the moment. A male represented specifically in the ancient mind, that of a force, that of agency, that of movement forward, rather than the feminine expression, which was more subservient. Once again, this is a topic in and of itself. But I think it's actually interesting. You could parallel this with the Kabbalistic structure of the Sfirot. Not that this is my go-to, but the male and the female side, one has one expression, the other has the other expression, but nobody looks at one as being better or worse than the other. We only do that when we sort of concretize it in terms of how you should treat a specific male or a specific female. Throughout the Kabbalistic symbolism, but also within ancient symbolism, male represented something and the feminine represented something else. Rav Hirsch is drawing on this, that it had to be the male, which means that vitality and agency has to be central to our lives. This isn't talking about a man per se. Both men and women had to partake in the Carta of Pesach, but they had to look at themselves as lambs, as in the flock of the Almighty, not decompartmentalized, not fractured, and male in terms of focal point of agency, both men and women. And lastly, it had to be in its first year. It had to be forever young, forever vital, forever focused on that youthful excitement and curiosity and that drive towards your Yiddishkeit and your religion. That how you connect to God shouldn't be you go into a rote. It should be constantly revitalized. A good expression of this is when I say to someone that if the same way I taught last year is the same way I teach this year, something has seriously failed. If the tools I'm using last year are the same tools I'm using this year, I failed. I should constantly be approaching things with a vitality, a curiosity, and a newness. So we have our first essay from Rav Hirsch on Nisan. Happens to be the 6th chronologically, but I had to prepare this for a class I'm giving on Wednesday, so I thought I'd get it out of the way first. We have the Magna Carta of the Jewish people, that foundational text that draws the Jewish people out of subservience and slavery. And we play this out by first analyzing the problem, the intergenerational trauma symbolized by the bris Spain of Asarim and the rupturing of the economic drive, the rupturing of the leadership, the rupturing of the independence and that confidence with the ox, the lamb, and the goat. The ox, the ram, and the goat had to be cut in half, but not the bird, representing that freedom, that spirituality, that flight. That remained whole. That remained whole as being what you would call that spark that never goes out, that always can be drawn back on. When a person is just lost, that spark remains. And then we played it further into the actual building up of this broken people with 4 covenants. The covenant of individualism, the covenant of equality, and what holds these is the covenant of the home. And then what joins them together, the covenant of dignity. And then we wrap this all together by identifying the metaphysics of identity. What is the covenant that the individuals are supposed to become? What are they in relationship to God? Full, not decompartmentalized. Male, as in focused in their agency, not the passivity, for both men and women adopting this framework. And lastly, the vitality of the firstborn, of the first year. Constant renewal, constant vitality, and constant curiosity. If last year is like this year, we've done something wrong. As always, thank you for your time and have a wonderful week.